All right, but what's more important is finding out 37 ways that words can be wrong.
And what's more important than that is realizing that 37 is a big number,
Yes.
and these are already summarized. So we just decided to pick our favorite three,
Yeah.
and everyone should skim this list. This is like the final wrap up on Humans Guides to Words. Like, hey, here's everything I covered. We're not going to recover everything he covered.
No. And each one of these, I believe all 37 of them have a link back to one of the posts where he originally talks about it in depth.
Yes.
The first one I picked was you talk about categories as if they were mana fallen from the Platonic realm rather than inferences implemented in a real brain. The ancient philosophers said Socrates is a man, not my brain perceptually classifies Socrates as a match against the human concept. Which, that last sentence is just the most rat sentence I've ever heard, man. So stereotypically us.
Yeah, it would be interesting, is the nice way to put it, to have a conversation with somebody that had sentences like that in it. But
Right? If they talked like that all the time.
yeah.
I've talked with him a few times, and they're not all like that. Sometimes these sentences do crop up just in natural conversation with him, but it's certainly not, a chock full kind of situation.
They feel organic when he does it somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess because it's him. That's how his brain works.
Exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, I really like this one because keeping in mind that concepts are a thing that our brains are using to keep track of the map that we have of the territory rather than real things that exist outside of us is pretty important.
Yeah. No, I agree. I'm going to divide out of order because this second one matches more with your first. Your verbal definition doesn't capture more than a tiny fraction of a category's shared characteristics, but you try to reason as if it does. I think that's the italicized sentence in here, and I think it's a great summary. But he talks about when philosophers of Plato's Academy claimed that the best definition of human was featherless biped, Diogenes the Cynic is said to have exhibited a plucked chicken and declared, "Here is Plato's man." The Platonists promptly changed the definition to a featherless biped with broad nails.
Yeah, that's a good point because people do that all the time.
The idea that we can't capture everything in our words or our definitions even, but we do reason as if we have. This is something to keep in mind. And when we're walking into a failure of reasoning, it's all too easy to do so when you're misstepping with your language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
My second one is kind of the inverse of this one. It's you draw your boundary around a volume of space where there is no greater than usual density, meaning that the associated word does not correspond to any performable Bayesian inferences. Drawing a shape around something where there's no real cluster there to keep hold of to talk about reasonably, and saying that it's a word now. My favorite example of this is demisexual. Are you familiar with the word demisexual?
I've heard of it.
It's the idea that if I'm a demisexual, I'm a person who's only attracted to other people after I've gotten to know them a bit. And I kind of hate this word because I'm like, that's just all humans, basically, like kind of on a spectrum. Obviously, we're a lot more attracted to people that we have met more and have more in common and connect more with. And sure, there's always exceptions. There's always like the one drop dead gorgeous hot person that you'd be like, okay, you said 2 sentences to me and I will go to bed with you because oh my god. But for the most part, demisexual is just another way of saying regular human, and it annoys me that there's a special word for it now.
Maybe some people just don't have the intuition or the reaction that Ryan Gosling's attractive.
Well, I personally, I don't know, man. Obviously tastes vary, but the idea that like we need a special word for people who are more attracted to people as they get to know them is not a thing that we actually need a special word for.
Yeah, that sounds like the human condition.
Yeah.
It could be that I think Ryan Gosling's more or less attractive the more I got to know him, but
right. If you get to know him and it turns out he's a real asshole, you're like, oh, maybe I wouldn't sleep with him after all. But if you get to know him and it turns out he's just the sweetest, kindest person in the world, you're like, Jesus, I really want your dick now.
Right. I mean, just the priors on him being attractive are, I've never met the guy, but it's just there. So
yeah.
All right. My next pick was the act of labeling something with a word disguises a challengeable inductive inference that you're making. If the last 11 egg-shaped objects you've drawn have been blue and the last 8 cubes drawn have been red, it's a matter of induction saying that this rule will hold true in the future. But if you call the blue eggs blegs and the red cubes rubes, you may reach into the barrel, feel an egg, and think, oh, a bleg. This was words as hidden inferences. Blegs and rubes came up a lot, and I like that because, picking a real example always draws contention. So making something up that's abstract and has a couple simple rules
Hmm.
is nice, easy way to illustrate the point. But
Hmm.
uh, it's this is we covered all the reasons I think we like these posts when we talk about the long form of them. But just
Yeah.
again, the act of labeling something with a word disguises a challengeable inductive inference.
Yeah.
And this is again something that we do all the time. If we say something is that actually comes up again with the attractiveness. The inference there
Mm,
is like I find them sexually desirable or something, right?
yeah.
Typically, unless someone's using it to mean they're have symmetrical features and they're well built or something, right?
Yeah.
Some people describe cars. Some people can describe cars as sexy, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, when you said Ryan Gosling was attractive, I didn't challenge that at all. But there is a challengeable inference in there. Like, how many people are how likely to want to go to bed with him, or to do him favors, or whatever.
Or even does attractiveness mean I want to go to bed with them? It could just mean that I think they're hot.
That's true. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I might just think like this person would be highly valued by members of the opposite sex.
Yeah.
Well, that was a darn good example. Then I like that Ryan Gosling keeps coming up.
It just seems appropriate.
Hopefully, if I was in a room with Ryan Gosling, he would keep coming up as well. But
Nice pun.
oh no,
We got
no, that was what? That was sexual innuendo. That doesn't count as a pun.
It's only not a pun if it's not sexual. All right.
I
You
will
keep
change.
drawing these false boundaries around stuff to keep your definitions careful.
There's no way I could ever define something that is funny as a pun, because we just know that by definition puns aren't funny.
Obviously.
Yes. All right. Let's take that to my final one here. You think that definitions can't be wrong, or that I can define a word any way I like. We talked about that one a bit before, about how words actually have real implications and should point to clusters in ThinkSpace. And therefore, just saying I can define a word any way I want does not work at all in the real world. I really like that point, and I need to keep remembering it, because it is a common thing to argue and even to believe, honestly, that we can define a word any way I want. And I want to mention this specifically because Wes in the Discord just yesterday had a bone to pick with me, because he said I was fucking around with defining the word spirituality. Because I've been, over the past 2 years, on a bit of a spirituality kick and trying to figure out why it's important to me and what the heck it even is. And I've come to the conclusion that spirituality is a sense, and more than just a sense, like an actual, in fact, being connected to something or things that are greater than like an individual. Often in terms of organizations, but it can be like structures. It can be anything that is like larger, both in space and in time, than a human is, and makes you kind of feel awe and like you want to be a part of it, is what I would consider to be spirituality. And Wes was like, dude, it has the word spirit in the name. If it doesn't have a spirit and some kind of supernatural in there, it's not spirituality. And I was like, dude, nobody even knows what a spirit is. Nobody's out there got any kind of decent definition of it. And I don't know. I think that my definition of spirituality actually correctly captures the vibes of how people feel when they use the word, but maybe I'm interacting with a strange subsection of humanity, and maybe most people do use it to mean a thing that must include a supernatural spirit. I don't know how I feel at this point about using a word. Like, I think it definitely has a certain vibe, and I think I'm capturing that vibe, but people could argue with me.
I think that all of us, you and me, and everyone listening, and everybody on Earth interacts with a weird subset of humanity, unless you happen to know thousands of people.
Okay, that's fair.
Because the thing you're talking about, you can get that sense by planting a tree whose shade you'll never enjoy, right?
Exactly.
But a lot of people will talk about it in the sense of, I feel a presence when I'm in a church or something,
Hmm.
and they don't mean the presence of the people who built it or the weight of history behind it. They mean that they feel. I was going to use the word spiritual. They feel
Yeah.
a connection to a otherworldly entity, right?
I think what they are feeling is that history and that building and the people that made it. And that's hard to place into words. And it's very easy to default to thinking that this feeling must be related to a actual entity, a person type entity. And so it gets transferred to that. But that's a mistake people made.
That could be, certainly in some cases, but and I think in others, somebody might just refer to the act of prayer as spiritual, and yeah, that builds. You can stretch your definition to be like, well, that's the edifice of the culture of religion built around it and stuff. But a lot of people do have a splash of magic in that word
Yeah.
that is actual magic and not the kind of magic we're talking about.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is one of those things where words are slippery, and so you can define a word any way you like. Just to lean on that for a second, like we need to be able to talk about what we need. We need to be able to know what we're talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in the
Mm-hmm.
context, if we're having a discussion about free will, we'll need to lay out what it is we're actually talking about. We can define words. We can make up new words. Again, what does sound mean, right?
And to make things even more slippery, like word definitions do drift over time. And after 100, 200 years, they might mean something fairly different from what they meant, a few centuries ago.
Yeah. I mean, or even 15 minutes ago if the conversation is not kept on track, right?
Well, sure, but I meant like just in terms of common usage.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, that's going to be a problem no matter what, but I'm just thinking like it's important to have definitions for the words that you're talking about during a conversation,
Mm-hmm.
but you can't just like I mean, so it's trying to like the religion example. If somebody's saying, well, I think God is that sense of awe you get when you look at something with history. Well, then they're not using that word the way everyone else is using it, right?
Yeah.
And they can kind of Mott and Bailey if they're trying to do that too. So
Yeah.
all right, third one I grabbed here was you try to treat category membership as all or nothing, ignoring the existence of more and less typical subclusters.
Yeah.
All right, I mean, and his example was, a favorite of mine too. Ducks and penguins are less typical birds than robins and pigeons.
Right.
Interestingly, a between groups experiment showed that subjects thought a disease was more likely to spread from robins to ducks on an island than from ducks to robins. Which is, I remember that from that post. That was typicality and asymmetrical similarity. So read the rest of these. We only covered there's 31 more to go. So they're fun. This is a great way to segue into it. So
Yeah.
actually, it's a great way to segue into what starts off the next sequence. When I was reading the dissolving the question post, our next post here, I was thinking, oh man, this is like the perfect kind of capstone post for the Human's Guide to Language sequence. The last one was a summary, and this is like kind of like the bringing it all home. And then I realized at the top it says Reductionism 101. And and first of all, I've had the thought of this is the capstone post like 3-4 times going through the sequence because a lot of them feel that way.
Yeah.
But then I realized, oh, this is actually a whole different sequence. And the reason that, this feels like the language one is because he had to build all of the edifice of like, here's how language is going to be used here to even have this conversation about reductionism.
Yeah. He was playing a very long game.
Yeah. I mean, the whole sequence, the whole enterprise of writing the sequences was a long game, and I love it so much. But yeah, I mean, the idea of trying to dive into a conversation about reductionism while we're still hung up on, well, what does free will, actually mean? The idea that it could, quote, actually mean anything is the problem we have to get over to even start having this conversation, right?
I love that near the very beginning, he was like, let me tell you about inferential distances and what you have to do to cross them. And then he's been spending this entire time building up the bridge to cross the inferential distance here.
Yeah. And I love at the post at the end of that, the one that talks about inferential distances. He says, now try and explain this concept in 2 or 3 sentences.
Yes.
And I still do try to do that because, it's a concept that I don't know if I would have grasped it, in 2 or 3 sentences on my first hearing of it. But like, if I want to explain what it is, like the general concept of, this person knows a lot about something. And when they're explaining it to somebody, they assume a baseline of knowledge that just isn't there. That hints that's sort of the thing, it captures part of it, but it's hard to summarize this stuff. That's why there's hundreds of blog posts rather than 12.
Yeah. Well, he starts off our second post, dissolving the question, by saying that if a tree falls in the forest, no one hears it, does it make a sound? And pointing out that when he tackled this question, he didn't answer it. He didn't pick a position of yes or no. He went and deconstructed the human algorithm for processing words, even going so far as to sketch an illustration of a neural network. At the end, I hope there was no question left, not even the feeling of a question. And I'm not sure if the tree falling in the forest necessarily counts as this, because when I first read this, I had already dismissed the question as dumb, but it was a very good small toy example to start with, and I think he's right that he didn't actually answer it. He just pointed out like all the ways that this isn't even really a question if you dig down into it.
Right. And by making it explicit by saying he's like, look, I didn't answer the question. I dissolved it.
Yeah.
And at the end of it, this is the important part, that you're not even left feeling like there should be a question left to answer.
Yeah.
Whereas, this came up sometimes in the previous sequence about, but is it really a bleg or not? You shouldn't, if you're attacking this correctly, you shouldn't be left with any lingering hang up there, right?
Right.
You just understand like this is a blue cube, right?
Yeah.
And so it's neither. Yeah.
You've answered all the individual parts, and you realize that left in the center is this thing that your brain was using, the neural network, to try to classify things in order to make induction quicker and easier, but it doesn't actually point to anything in real life, and so you don't need to answer it.
Yeah, no, perfect. Exactly.
Yeah. So he takes this step further, maybe more than one step, takes this a million steps further, and goes from a tree falling to free will. And goes on to say that, like, when you're trying to answer this, you can prove that free will is impossible until the sun goes cold, but this leaves an unexplained fact of cognitive science. If free will doesn't exist, what goes on inside the head of a human being who thinks it does? And he points out that this is not a rhetorical question. He actually thinks it's important to figure out what's going on inside the brain of someone who thinks it does.
Yeah, and this is because proving that you are confused doesn't make you any less confused.
Mm-hmm.
Proving that a question is meaningless may or may not help you more than answering it. It's funny, in just like a couple weeks ago on Slack, or I guess on Teams, because my company is not cool in that one specific regard. Someone like mentioned determinism and was like, "Oh yeah, this is interesting," and I was like, "Oh yeah, that was me 20 years ago." But it's not like I'm not throwing shit at them. It's just this is something I thought about a long time ago. But in a conversation just a couple days ago with somebody, they'd come across, their first kind of like free will isn't a thing argument. And my reply was that it wouldn't be even clear to me what it would mean if it was true in the sense that people conceptualize it to be.
Mm-hmm.
But I realized at the time, and, reemphasizing it now, that wouldn't make the person I was talking with any less confused, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, this question is a confusion, but that doesn't make them feel less confused about the question.
Interesting thing is, I have also been talking with a friend recently about the free will thing, and we've boiled down that we agree on absolutely every single matter of substance, but we disagree on the vibes. And really, when you agree on everything else, all that's really left is the vibes part, right?
Pretty much, yeah. There was a really fun, and it was like recorded in a bar conversation with Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett. Dennett is a famous compatibilist, professional philosopher, and Sam Harris wrote a book on free will that he says, like, he took the hard determinist stance. The thing is, all of those labels you can just toss out because they agreed on everything.
Yeah,
they tried to think of examples of, if I'm remembering correctly, of like, would this count as free will? If you wound back the clock, would it have gone differently? No. Well, then what does that mean? There's distinctions between like being coerced or having few choices, right? Versus like being able to summon a thought from the ether on purpose and act on that, right? Anyway, yeah, it's I agree that this is definitely a few steps above tree falling sounds, right?
Yeah. The next thing I pulled out is that he says, once you understand in detail how your brain generates the feeling of the question, once you realize that your feeling is an unanswered question corresponding to an illusory central unit wanting to know whether it should fire, even after all the edge units are clamped at known values, then you're done. Which I guess we're kind of at, although I still have a little lingering thing, which is important because the next point he says is that if there's any lingering feeling of a remaining unanswered question, or of having been fast talked into something, then this is a sign that you have not dissolved the question. A vague dissatisfaction should be as much a warning as a shout. Really dissolving the question doesn't leave anything behind. And that feels true because I don't feel any sort of lingering anything about whether a tree falling makes a sound. It's just a non-question to me. Whereas I still sometimes argue free will with people, even though we agree on every single detail.
It's interesting. It took me years to kind of have all of the lingering feeling of unanswered question. It took years for that to finish dissolving. Actually, I read the books, I bought the arguments, and it all made sense. But I still had like this. Well, if, I still feel like I'm choosing stuff, and like that. But that's not actually the question.
Mm-hmm.
I do feel like I'm pretty settled on this, and so I don't really have arguments with people, but I do have conversations with people who like talking about it. But I'm not. I'm on this question. I'm past feeling confused. Luckily, don't get me wrong. I'm confused on basically everything, but this one I'm feeling pretty good about. Consciousness comes up quite a bit. Has come up quite a bit in our last couple of in person meetups, and there's
Yeah.
definitely some confusion there. We're still working that out.
Is consciousness meaningfully different from free will?
Yes, I would think so.
I guess you can't have free will unless you have consciousness.
That sounds more true.
Okay.
Again, putting a big flag next to the words free will, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, you're certainly not making choices if you're a rock. The next thing on the bullet points here was that it seems to me that at least 20% of the real world effectiveness of a skilled rationalist comes from not stopping too early. This links back to a post, the meditation on curiosity. If you keep asking questions, you'll get to your destination eventually. If you decide too early that you found an answer, you won't. I love that.
Yeah.
Sometimes you run out of time. Sometimes you realize it's not worth the effort or whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
it's careful to keep in mind that, hey, I'm stopping here not because I have an answer, but because I'm just done. Versus, well, I've solved it.
Yeah. And that goes back to the vague dissatisfaction from before, that if there's any lingering feeling, don't stop just yet.
Right. And that links to your strength as a rationalist.
Yes.
There we go.
The very next thing, I think it was the next thing he said after that, maybe a sentence or two later, was he says, the challenge above all is to notice when you are confused, even if it just feels like a tiny little bit of confusion. I wanted to just pull that out and highlight it again because I notice I am confused is a thing that's sort of lost its original meaning, I feel, in rationalist culture. And people sometimes say it just to be like, I don't know what you're talking about. Explain more of that. Or, it stopped having this more specific meaning of you think you've answered something and there's still a little niggling, whatever, but you're just going to ignore it because you're pretty sure you've answered the thing and you want to keep moving on. And the challenge is to no, notice, hold on a second. There is a little thing there that's still unexplained, and you still got that little bit of confusion. And if you just pass over it, someday in the future it might come around and bite you in the ass. Notice that confusion and jump on it and work on that is what this was originally, I believe, supposed to mean. And nowadays people just say, I notice I'm confused, sometimes even just as a dunk on someone, after they make an argument.
That's unfortunate. I mean, because I still try my best to stick with the original intention of it, and because it's one of the hardest. I don't know if anyone does this successfully all the time or not. If so, they're some black belt rationalist. But I try to do this with varying degrees of success all the time, and it's actually really hard. In retrospect, I'll be like, oh, I noticed I was confused about that at the time. I should have noticed or should have raised that to conscious attention.
Yeah,
because
then it's always so embarrassing when.
Well, depends on how embarrassing, but I try not to feel too bad of it. Like a recent example, I was at my grandma's house this weekend, and we're looking for her phone, so I called it, and then I found it, and then I noticed my number came up as a number, not as a name. And I was like, well, hold on a minute. Let me see. And then I go into and so I could have just been like, oh, here's your phone. And just kind of let that little niggling dissatisfaction, that confusion kind of just evaporate. But I was like, hold on, let's look at this. And she's, 88, or 87 and isn't very tech savvy. And so I'm going through the contacts and two of the numbers in my phone number are transposed. And so I was like, oh, this is why, when you mentioned some time ago that you tried to call me that it didn't go through. It's because you called some random phone number and left them a voice message. So again, it's a baby example, but it's helpful in that now, like my grandma can call me if she needs to, right? And she'll answer the phone if I call her.
Right. It's a very solid example and has good emotional resonance. So hopefully easier to remember too.
Yeah. I guess I'm just trying to think. I wish I could think of like a more fun, like higher stakes one, but this one was just yesterday, the day before. So it's salient in availability anyway.
Well, this post ends on one of Eliezer's biggest mistakes. He says, homework problem. What kind of cognitive algorithm, as felt from the inside, would generate the observed debate about free will? Don't explain why people believe in free will, explain how. And the reason we have not yet solved AI alignment is because every rationalist except Eliezer is still stuck trying to do this homework problem. So he sabotaged his own movement
Why do you say that?
because we're still debating about free will.
Well, like philosophers are, but are the rest of us
I literally was just a few days ago with someone. So,
with another rationalist?
yes.
Oh, well, then
I would say yes, despite the fact that she would say no. She's rat adjacent.
I mean, and that's close enough for my count. I guess it's let me go about it this way. Did you guys try to talk about why you feel like you have free will, or did you guys try and like define free will in a way that you both agreed on? Because that homework problem is easier. I remember when I first read this, I was like, oh man, this is like, because this was, in my earlier philosophy days, and I thought this was profound and challenging, and it still is both, but it's not nearly as like high a mountain as it used to be for me to try and get to the bottom of this. Like without putting any formalization on it, like the algorithm is basically like people see chocolate and vanilla ice cream in front of them, they feel a deliberation and they pick one, and they have a sense that I chose this one because I wanted to. I could have chosen the other one if I wanted that one, right?
Right.
That's roughly the set of steps that leads to the reason why someone would say, well, I have free will, that's why I chose that one. But it's, and I don't think that actually that would maybe get me a D on this homework assignment, just because that was my quick and dirty answer. But
that's at least a C answer, man.
Well,
because I think that's basically the correct answer.
Yeah, but I would need more formalization, and I think not like necessarily mathy stuff, but just a bit more clarity. But
but you would say that is not actually free will.
I wouldn't. Again, I'm not sure what free will. I mean, we can slap a definition on it really quick if you want, just for fun. But the definition people usually mean is like,
yeah, my definition would be exactly what you just said, that there is a deliberative process inside your mind, and that deliberative process is what determined whether you pick the chocolate or vanilla.
See, I think that's different than how most people use it. They say that that deliberative process was conscious and intentional, and they could have chosen the other one if they felt like it. If I ask you right now to name a city, I'm asking you to name a city.
London.
Why did you pick London?
I'd recently seen the word London, so it was still high in my availability, probably.
I mean, was that a free choice that you made though? Like, because you probably saw New York at some point in the recent past, or San Francisco.
It was the deliberative process within my mind that came up with that word. So yes.
I mean, like, were you free to have chosen San Francisco?
Sure.
I mean, were you free to have chosen?
I didn't, but like when you say if I had wanted to choose vanilla, I would have chosen vanilla. I think that is just another way of saying this deliberative process could have theoretically output vanilla if some of the initial parameters had been different, which is just trivially true.
Exactly. That's why I pivoted to the city thing, because I realized when I'd said if I wanted, the thing is, the whole contention is that you don't choose your wants, right? Or you don't choose your preferences in that moment. Normally, I like chocolate ice cream, but I had chocolate something for lunch, so I'm not having chocolate for dessert.
Yeah, but that doesn't change which deliberative process is the one that created the output.
No, but it just changes the output. And then so, like when people say,
sure.
"Well, I could have chosen the other one," and it's if the universe was different, it would have been different, but it wasn't, so it's not, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But yes.
So I think
we are once again violently agreeing.
There we go. All right, we did it.
Yeah.
Anyway, the last sentence here was the one that made me feel like I was not equipped to climb this mountain of rationality. This is one of the first real challenges I tried as an aspiring rationalist once upon a time. One of the easier conundrums, relatively speaking. May it serve you likewise. And the fact that it took me the better part of a decade to totally to feel like I have the confusion dissolved there makes me feel like I suck at this. Because it's different speeds for different folks, and I'm not going to give myself a hard time, but it's just kind of funny that it's like, oh yeah, this was a baby problem I worked out, when I was a wild and reckless youth.
Yeah.
This thing that philosophers are still arguing about and have been for 4,000 years. The key is not to again solve the problem of free will. The key is to explain why people feel like they have it and what's actually going on there to a level that satisfies everybody, right?
Yeah.
So I think going back to the tree, making noise in the forest, the answer isn't to say it makes a sound or not. The answer is to explain why people disagree. And then once you do, because that one's trivial, you can do it in 2 sentences, then they're like, oh yeah, there is no argument there.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can do that with the free will thing. I think actually fairly quickly. I think for me, the reason it took longer is because I wasn't deliberately solving the homework problem.
Yeah, I just kept reading the sequences.
Well, no, I mean, that same here, but I mean, like, you mentioned your conversation earlier this week with somebody, you weren't talking about, the cognitive algorithm that generates the feeling of the observed debate of free will, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You were talking about what does free will mean? Do we make choices or whatever, right?
Right.
So part of I think what it took me longer is I didn't keep my eye on the actual ball. We'll have to keep our eye on stuff going forward because we've got 2 more Less Wrong posts next time.
We do. Those Less Wrong posts are wrong questions and writing a wrong question.
How appropriate. I'm glad we get them both at the same time.